Many in the Russian Z community had high hopes for Yevgeny Prigozhin as an effective and victorious war commander, and for Wagner as the strongest Russian unit, hopeful they could lead Russia to victory in the unprovoked war against Ukraine. These hopes were epically shattered in a short and anticlimactic coup attempt. Yes, unlike the Euromaidan, it was a coup by Prigozhin, causing his demise as a political figure. Prigozhin's so-called March of Justice was by far the most important development related to the war in Ukraine in the second half of June. But Ukraine has also made some meaningful gains in its counter-offensive. Welcome to our newest update on the war in Ukraine, covering the developments from the second half of June. Prigozhin's coup is a stark reminder that Putin's invasion still has unintended consequences, consequences we've felt ourselves for the last 18 months. After all, the invasion kicked off a chain of events that wiped out over $36 trillion from financial markets, many of which experienced their worst year since the 2008 crisis. It also has unintended effects elsewhere. Last year was the best ever for the fine art market in terms of sales, a market that has currently surged past even its pre-pandemic levels, an extraordinary result for one company already at work in the market for years, our longtime sponsor Masterworks, who have paid out 11 exits now during the course of our partnership, with every exit returning a profit to their investors. Recent sales even netted everyday investors 10, 13 and 35% returns. Masterworks has now delivered the net proceeds from over $45 million in sales, a historic milestone that they want to celebrate with a new deal, exclusive to Kings and Generals viewers. So for a limited time, when you click the link in the description, you'll automatically get a no-obligation membership account from Masterworks. For months, Prigozhin has been conflicting with Shoigu and Gerasimov, demanding more ammunition for Wagner, heavily criticizing the Russian military leadership for their incompetence and lies, and informing about clandestine efforts of the Russian army to sabotage Wagner, which has even led to a skirmish. The Wagner boss finally made his move on June 23rd. Probably the tipping point was the decision of the Russian Ministry of Defense to centralize all so-called volunteer battalions, including the Wagner group, under its own command. Prigozhin had the option to submit or to resist. He chose the latter after going on another scathing informational attack on the Russian elite. Prigozhin accused the Kremlin of attacking Ukraine under false pretenses, and claimed that the main motivation behind the invasion was to enrich the oligarchs, including the Russian military elite. He also accused Shoigu of lying to the Russian public about the number of Russian casualties and the situation on the battlefield. This was followed by a video shared by Wagner-connected Telegram channels, which showed footage of an alleged missile strike on the Wagner base in Ukraine. Many claimed that this video was a fabrication, but it was sufficient as a casus belli for Prigozhin. He declared the start of the so-called March of Justice on Moscow to deal with Shoigu and Gerasimov. The Wagner boss called on Russian soldiers to join him, or at least not to resist him, as he decided to send his troops first to Rostov, one of the key logistical hubs of the Russian invasion, where Shoigu and Gerasimov reportedly set up shop to plan their operations against Wagner. The supposed ally of Prigozhin, former commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine, Sergei Surovikin, recorded a video calling on Wagner forces to turn back, but to no avail. On the morning of June 24th, they crossed the border to Russia with minor or no resistance. They soon took control of Rostov, where Prigozhin casually chatted with the Deputy Defense Minister, Yevkurov, and the Deputy of the GRU Chief, Alexeyev. As a side note, GRU was reportedly behind the creation of Wagner. The monster the all-powerful Russian Foreign Intelligence Service was no longer in control of. Some footage indicates fighting in Rostov, but the cause is unknown, since Wagner soldiers looked quite comfortable in this city and conversed freely with Rostov residents, who seemingly supported them. Part of the Wagner troops stayed in Rostov, while the rest continued to Voronezh as Putin finally spoke. He called Wagner's march an armed rebellion and an act of treason, which would be defeated. If Prigozhin somehow hoped for Putin's support, or at least neutrality in this conflict, it became clear that he was now against the Kremlin's whole state and military machine. Any hopes of Prigozhin to divide the Russian elite proved to be in vain. Even though the Russian ground forces did not resist Wagner's march on Moscow, the Russian Air Force conducted several attacks on the Wagner column, which had Pantsir air defense systems. They reportedly shot down 3 Mi-8 MTPR electronic warfare helicopters, 1 Mi-8 helicopter, 1 Ka-52 helicopter, 1 Mi-35 helicopter, 1 Mi-28 helicopter, and 1 command center plane of the Russian military. The Russian Air Force did not manage to inflict that much damage on the Wagner column, reportedly destroying just 1 truck. Russian sources claim that the Wagner column marching on Moscow consisted of up to 4,000 men, 350 pieces of equipment, including 9 tanks, 4 Tiger infantry fighting vehicles, Grad MLRS, a howitzer, and many non-armored vehicles. The column continued marching on Moscow, encountering only minor obstacles, as unconfirmed rumors of the hasty escape of the Russian elite from the capital, including Putin, circulated on social media. The Russian military prepared defensive positions on the river Oka, waiting for the Wagner column. But as the world braced for the Battle of Moscow, the ill-fated coup of Prigozhin ended in a negotiated solution. In an agreement mediated by Belarus President Lukashenko, Prigozhin agreed to turn back his troops in exchange for amnesty of Wagner fighters and the resignation of Shoigu and Gerasimov. But it soon became clear that if the latter was ever agreed upon, Putin did not intend to honor his part of the agreement, as both Shoigu and Gerasimov still occupy their offices. Following the announcement of the agreement, the Wagnerites withdrew from Rostov. Wagner transferred its equipment to the Russian army. Wagner mercenaries were allowed to sign contracts with the Russian army, but Prigozhin stated that only 1–2% chose to do that. According to Lukashenko and several other sources, Prigozhin moved to Belarus, although he has also been spotted in St. Petersburg. Many things about the fate of Wagner are not known yet. Some speculate that they already have a base in Belarus and will serve the Belarus government now. But there are also rumblings about the Kremlin clamping down on Wagner operations overseas. We do not have a clear picture of the future of the Wagner group, but we can confidently state that their days of fighting in Ukraine are over, at least under the Wagner brand. But what about Prigozhin's short-lived coup? What really happened? The most obvious answer is that after Shoigu decided on mandatory centralization of all military and paramilitary units under the MOD control, Prigozhin decided to capitalize on his popularity in the Russian public and links in the Russian security apparatus and move against the Russian military leadership. In anticipation of this day, Wagner has reportedly been hoarding ammunition for 2 months. So perhaps all these demands for more ammo from Shoigu and Gerasimov during the Battle of Bakhmut were made to be prepared for any move against them at some point. Some speculate that Prigozhin hoped for Putin's neutrality during the so-called March of Justice. He would graciously enter Moscow without a single shot fired, inform the Tsar Batyushka about the real state of affairs in Ukraine and about the lies of his military commanders, and Putin would just side with him. If this really was Prigozhin's plan, then it was a huge gamble, particularly after it became clear that Putin refused to back down to Prigozhin's pressure and called him a traitor. None in the Russian political and military elite sided with Prigozhin, as even his purported ally Surovikin told the Wagner troops to turn back. This has apparently not saved Surovikin from Putin's wrath, as many sources report about General Armageddon's arrest, who is claimed to have been aware of Prigozhin's rebellion in advance and to sympathize with it. Prigozhin was alone, facing the state of Russia without any allies. By the time the Wagner column reached the Oka River, it was a matter of proverbial crossing of the Rubicon or backing down. Most probably, Prigozhin understood that he was either going to start a bloody civil war where his chances of victory were low, or take the last opportunity to save himself and his troops, risking losing all his leverage and popularity in Russia, but avoiding ending up in the history of Russia as another traitor general who turned back against the motherland in the time of war. Prigozhin understood this and opted to accept Lukashenko's solution and back down. What are the main impacts of Wagner's march on Moscow on the war in Ukraine? Russia has lost the unit behind the capture of Popasna, Rubizhne, Soledar and Bakhmut, arguably the most effective fighting force it had in Ukraine. While Putin ultimately defeated the rebellion, scenes of destroyed helicopters and an inability to stop the Wagner column before it reached the Moscow Oblast will be detrimental to the all-conquering strategist image that Putin has in the Russian public, or at least had until the war in Ukraine turned into a protracted conflict. It is noteworthy that since the Wagner coup, Putin, or individuals who look like Putin, have been very active publicly, even meeting with commoners in Dagestan. According to the Russian National Guard chief Zolotov, they will start receiving tanks. Every tank given to the Rosgvardia is a tank the Russian army will not get in Ukraine. But in general, the impact of Prigozhin's failed rebellion has been quite minimal so far on the war in Ukraine, as the Kremlin managed to avoid an internal collapse, which would have caused a collapse of the front in Ukraine. The Russian army in Ukraine maintains its fighting capacity, even though Smuter at home may have further harmed its morale. What will happen to Prigozhin? While the criminal case on armed rebellion has been shut down, Putin has already called for an investigation on the use of close to $1 billion of state money, which he admitted to having spent on Wagner. Prigozhin may be safe for the time being, but it is hard to believe that Putin would refrain from punishing him at some point in Belarus or anywhere else. Prigozhin had best avoid drinking tea and standing next to windows in high-rise buildings in the company of his old Russian friends for the time being. For now, Shoigu and Gerasimov remain in their positions. Shoigu has been very visible in the information space since the coup, visiting troops in Ukraine and taking part in the post-coup meeting on analysis of the situation chaired by Putin. It seems unlikely for Putin to sack Shoigu at this point, since it will look like acquiescing to Prigozhin's demands, which is bad optics for an authoritarian strongman like Putin. By the end of June, the Kremlin seized most of Prigozhin's business, and the reports from the Middle East and North Africa claimed that the Wagner military hardware in Syria was seized, while the Turkish Air Force attacked their base in Libya. Even though Ukraine did not get the best possible outcome from Prigozhin's rebellion, they made progress in several sections of the battlefield in the second half of June. On the Zaporizhia front, the Ukrainian army has continued to pressure Russian defenses throughout the front line. On June 17th, the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade liberated Pyatikhatki. The Russians attempted several unsuccessful counterattacks to regain control of this village. On the Velika Novosilka axis, the AFU gained some ground north of Urozhaina on the same day. On June 18th, the Ukrainians launched a Storm Shadow missile on the Russian ammunition depot in Rykove. According to several military commentators, the scale of destruction and the duration of secondary explosions indicates that this was a theatre-level ammunition depot, which served the Russian army on the Zaporizhia front and the Kherson front. If that is the case, Russia would likely decrease the intensity of artillery shelling on Ukrainian positions before the woeful Russian logistics managed to bring more military assets to the ground and compensate for the Rykove explosion. Ukrainians have also destroyed the rail bridges leading to Rykove, which would further complicate and delay Russian supplies. On June 22nd, more Storm Shadows were fired on Russian supply lines, as the highway bridge in Chonha connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine was damaged. Images of the bridge circulated on social media show a big hole and some structural damage. If the Chonha bridge becomes unusable for the Russian army, their supply lines from Crimea to Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts would have to pass through the E97 and E58 highways, extending the journey from 157 kilometers to almost 300 kilometers. These strikes indicate that the Ukrainian counter-offensive on the Zaporizhia front would look more like the Kherson campaign rather than the Kharkiv route. The Ukrainians may have scaled down their assaults on fortified and heavily mined Russian defensive lines, and instead chosen to exhaust the Russian military infrastructure by precision attacks on their supply lines and military assets. Ukraine will likely continue these strikes to weaken Russian forces on the Zaporizhia front before committing more ground troops for assaults there. Also on June 22nd, Ukraine advanced for about 1.5 kilometers north of Robotyne, pushing back the 291st and 70th Motorized Regiments of the Russian army, while also achieving some progress west of Makarivka. On June 26th, the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade pushed Russian forces out of Rivnopil in the Velika Novosilka axis. By the end of June, the AFU gained more ground around Robytne and advanced on Prigozhin. According to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry official Malia, the Ukrainian army liberated 130 square kilometers of land on the Zaporizhian front since the start of the counter-offensive as of June 26th. The Ukrainians have still not been able to achieve a decisive breakthrough anywhere on the Zaporizhia front or reach the first heavily fortified line of the Russian army. They are still delayed by minefields and Russian Ka-52 attack helicopters, which take advantage of the lack of Ukrainian air defense systems on the front line. But targeting of the Russian military infrastructure and their supply lines will likely continue, which will inevitably weaken Russian defenses. The drying of the Kakova reservoir and increased activity of Ukrainian saboteur groups on the left bank of the Dnipro may also create an opportunity to influence the situation on the Zaporizhian front. Some military commentators have speculated that the Ukrainians may use the now dry surface of the reservoir to cross onto the left bank of the Dnipro. In contrast, others have argued that the surface is too muddy for the armoured vehicles to cross, which will also be under the constant artillery barrage of the Russian army in an open field. On June 25th, Russian sources reported the capture of a bridgehead on the left bank of the Dnipro in the Antonivsky Bridge area by Ukrainian forces. The following day, they reported a similar development in the Dachi area near Oleshki. Russian military bloggers report about 50 to 100 Ukrainian troops continuing to control the bridgehead, as all the Russian attempts to displace them have been defeated by the intensive activity of the Ukrainian artillery on the right bank, along with the use of electronic warfare tools, which negate the threat of Russian drones. Several months ago, a similar situation was reported on the left bank of the Dnipro, and we argued that this did not mean the start of a larger Ukrainian attack across the river. The same situation is observed now. The area of Ukrainian control has boggy terrain, which makes it extremely difficult to use armoured vehicles. It will be hard to expand the bridgehead without armoured vehicles. Still, the Ukrainians will likely continue being active on the left bank of the Dnipro, at least to fix Russian troops and prevent them from assisting Russian defense of the Zaporizhia Oblast. To conclude the topic of Zaporizhia, we must examine the alarming statements of the Ukrainian leadership regarding the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. On June 20th, the chief of the Ukrainian military intelligence, Kyrylo Budinov, stated that the Russians had mined 4 out of 6 power units and its cooling pond, preparing for the destruction of the power plant in case of a Ukrainian advance on the Zaporizhia front. He claimed that the situation had never been as serious as it is now. Zelensky has repeatedly spoken on this topic in this period, urging the international community to act to prevent this disastrous scenario. Ukrainian forces and healthcare workers have been drilling to mitigate a possible power plant explosion. The representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency reported on June 21st that they had not seen any mines at the cooling pond, but confirmed that the Russians had mined the areas in and around the power plant. Russian sources have dismissed these claims or argued that the Ukrainian government is conducting an information campaign prepared for the destruction of the power plant to blame it on Russia later. On June 23rd, US Senators Graham and Blumenthal submitted a bipartisan resolution to the Senate, calling for the invocation of NATO Article 5 in case of the destruction of the Zaporizhia power plant by Russia. In this period, the Ukrainian army achieved notable progress on the Donbass front, particularly in the Bakhmut section. On June 22nd, the 53rd Mechanized Brigade gained some ground north of Vodiana, while the 79th Air Assault Brigade took Russian positions southeast of Krasnohorivka, which Russia has occupied since 2014. On June 25th, the Ukrainian command reported about the liberation of the western bank of the Seversky Donets Channel by the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. The Ukrainian army also pushed the Russians back out of their bridgehead, towards Azarynivka and Kerdymivka, while advancing west of Klishchiivka in the southern flank of Bakhmut. On the northern flank, successful offensive operations from Orakovo-Vasilivka towards Dubovo-Vasilivka and Bakivka were reported. By June 28th, the 28th Mechanized Brigade liberated a dam west of Kerdymivka. On June 29th, Ukraine's 80th Air Assault Brigade made some progress along the MO3 highway near Zaliznianska. Ukrainian forces are continuing the pincer movement on the Bakhmut flanks as we speak, with an aim to encircle the Russian units in Bakhmut or force them to withdraw from the city they have been fighting to capture for almost 8 months. Finally, on the North Luhansk front, Russian troops have been trying to gain the initiative. On June 19th, Malia reported about a difficult situation in the Kupiansk section, while sources reported about a Russian advance between 500 meters and 2 kilometers south of Kreminna. Ukrainian sources later claimed counterattacks in this area led to the liberation of some territories, but the situation is covered by the fog of war as of June 30th. The Ukrainian army is carrying out difficult offensive operations in densely mined and heavily fortified areas without air superiority. They are grinding through Russian defenses slowly and looking for more military support from their allies to sustain their offensive campaign. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief Solutioni has already criticized the reaction of some in the West, lamenting the slow pace of Ukraine's advance. In his interview with the Washington Post, he said, "It pisses me off. This is not a show. It's not a show the whole world is watching and betting on or anything. Every day, every meter is given by blood. Without being fully supplied, these plans are not feasible at all, but they are being carried out. Yes, maybe not as fast as the participants in the show, the observers, would like, but that is their problem." He has called for more Western support, and finally the delivery of Western-made jets, and more pledges of support were made in this period. On June 16th, defense ministers of NATO stated their intention to provide Ukraine more supplies and support it for as long as needed. Germany pledged to send an additional 64 guided missiles for Patriot air defense systems. Spain promised to deliver 4 Leopard 2 A4 tanks and 20 armored vehicles to Ukraine this month. On June 17th, the EU Commissioner Breton pledged to speed up delivery of military supplies to Ukraine, while promising that the military support to Ukraine would not depend on the AFU's success, as they are preparing for a war which may go on for months, if not more. On the same day, the Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov stated that Ukraine will receive F-16 fighter jets in 2024 at the earliest. On June 19th, defense ministries of Ukraine, Slovakia and Czechia signed a memorandum of intention to purchase Swedish CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles. Ukraine tends to purchase almost 1,000 of these vehicles. Also on that day, the Danish government announced a long-term military aid package for Ukraine worth $3.2 billion, which will be delivered from 2023 to 2028. Evidently, Ukraine's Western allies are starting to consider the security of Ukraine beyond this war. On June 20th, the Pentagon representative Singh reported that due to an accounting error, the US government has exaggerated the cost of military aid to Ukraine by $6.2 billion, after earlier making a similar statement mentioning $3 billion. This will free the United States government to send more military aid to Ukraine in the short term. On the same day, the president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, stated that the EU would offer 50 billion euros worth of aid to Kyiv and help them pay salaries, pensions and restoration of strategic objects damaged by the Russian invasion until 2027. A day later, Britain made a similar pledge, worth $3 billion, of World Bank loans to help the Ukrainian economy survive the Russian invasion. On June 21st, Latvia pledged to send its entire fleet of helicopters to Ukraine, while Germany promised more 155mm high-precision guided shells, 2 MAN HX-81 tank transporters, 6 border protection vehicles, 1,155mm artillery shells, and 381 million euros of humanitarian aid. The United States has also reported an increase in production of 155mm shells for Ukraine, up from 14,000 before the war to 24,000. On June 22nd, the EU promised 1.5 billion euros of macro-financial assistance to Kyiv. On June 23rd, the Turkish military industry giant Baykar gave a license to Ukraine to produce Bayraktar and more advanced Akinji drones in Ukraine. On June 25th, Germany stated its intention to give 45 Gepard self-propelled anti-air guns by the end of the year. On June 26th, Australia pledged to send 28 M113 armoured vehicles, 14 special operation vehicles, and more 105mm artillery shells, while the Bulgarian government approved a new military aid package to Ukraine. On the same day, Azerbaijan promised a mine-clearing vehicle to help with humanitarian demining. Poland pledged more guns and ammunition, while the United States promised 30 more Bradley armored fighting vehicles, 25 Stryker armored vehicles, more munitions for HIMARS, Patriots, and additional Javelins and Stingers. On June 27th, the EU foreign ministers agreed to provide €3.5 billion worth of additional military aid to Ukraine. On the following day, Lithuania promised to send 2 NASAMS air defense systems and 10 M13 armored personnel carriers, while information about Poland's intention to send ground-based long-range missile systems to Ukraine appeared in the media. Similar reports implying the preparation of the United States to send ATA-CMS long-range precision missiles and cluster munitions to Ukraine emerged in the Western media in this period. Lastly, on June 29th, Germany announced more pledges, including 1 TRML-4D air defense radar, 3 Biber bridge layers, and 16 Zetro trucks. All these pledges are very impressive. Ukraine may soon get ATA-CMS long-range missiles and cluster munitions, along with a replacement for its destroyed equipment, which will greatly enhance its offensive capabilities. There is also some momentum on the delivery of F-16s, and it looks like official pledges on their delivery will be made in the near future. The Ukrainian military industry is also playing its part, as on June 20th, Ukroboronprom claimed to have built a drone with a 1,000-kilometer range. There has been some movement on the diplomatic front as well. A delegation of 7 African states met with Zelensky in Kyiv on June 16th and Putin in Moscow on June 17th. They offered their peace plans to both sides, but the highlight of their diplomatic mission was the Russian strike on Kyiv, which forced African presidents to bomb shelters. On June 19th, US State Secretary Blinken visited Beijing, where the Chinese government confirmed that they are not planning to send military supplies to Russia. Later in the month, the Chinese ambassador to the EU, Fu Zong, stated that China is not against Ukraine restoring its 1991 borders. Bloody battles continue in Ukraine as the AFU is slowly liberating its territory. The Ukrainian government will hope for the continuation of support from its allies, since the alternative is the conflict getting frozen, which Ukraine desperately wants to avoid. But Russia's situation is extremely difficult too, as it returned from the brink of a civil war. Let's look at visually confirmed losses on both sides, provided by the Oryx blog, which has to be applauded for an amazing job it has been doing throughout this war. For Russia, these are 2,080 tanks, 4,188 armored vehicles, 245 command posts and communication stations, 782 artillery systems and vehicles, 218 multiple rocket launchers, 83 aircraft, 98 helicopters, and 253 drones. For Ukraine, these are 557 tanks, 1,678 vehicles, 15 command posts and communication stations, 322 artillery systems and vehicles, 46 multiple rocket launchers, 68 aircraft, 31 helicopters, and 146 drones. Our series on the Russo-Ukrainian War will continue, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see it. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive videos. Join the ranks of patrons and YouTube members via the link in the description or by pressing the button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, join our private Discord, and much more. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.